Good morning and welcome to Ask the Expert. I'm Joe Taylor. This morning, another in the ongoing series of programs presented by the Northwest Regional Key Program for Quality Early Learning. The program, through the Northwest Institute of Research, oversees a grant from the Office of Child Development and Early Learning at the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services and the Department of Education. The goal of the program is to improve the outcomes for young children as they prepare for school. John Posa from the Pennsylvania Key is the host of the program and is with us throughout the series. John, I usually ask, well, who do you have for us today? But I know who you have for us today. He's an old friend.
Definitely an old friend. We have Nathan Royster, who is the pastor of the Brookville Presbyterian Church. And Nathan has been on our program before, as well as on the Contact Show with you, Joe. And we just thought it would be a good time for Nathan to come on and to kind of put a little bit of perspective on some of the things that have been happening in our world, and specifically how we can relate and talk to children about these things. We have just not too long ago heard about the horrific tragedy in Las Vegas. We've been hearing about the devastation of hurricanes in Texas and Florida and the displacement of people in Puerto Rico and the earthquake in Mexico City, protests over social injustice, including in the very town where Nathan went to college at Charlottesville at the University of Virginia. So, Nathan, we thought it'd be a good time to kind of discuss the impact this has on young children and what should parents, it has to be a difficult time for young people who are witnessing these things, seeing it all on television. What should parents' role be in how they should communicate an understanding of these events?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, John. I think the first thing is to accept the fact that parents do have a role in this, that especially in 21st century culture where we're so inundated with media, there's really no sheltering children and youth from what's going on in the world and from a lot of the social and cultural trends that are going on. And so I think to really accept that role of talking about these and having a conversation and being intentional about that, because not only in the absence of that voice will other voices fill the void, but I think also, especially for younger children, they're going to kind of adapt their own, shall we call, logic or rationality, which isn't always in a good place, isn't always historically or morally informed. And so I think just really taking that responsibility to know that, to acknowledge that these are some traumatic and questionable things that are being seen, and creating that space within families to have those questions and those conversations. I think then the next step is to take that as an opportunity for ourselves to become better students too, to really question some of our own presumptions, some of our own biases, and trying to get as full and complete of a picture as possible, so that our children can better understand how they're, not just how they can approach and comprehend these issues.
Now, of course, first and foremost is to not neglect talking about it, because to just ignore it kind of compounds the problem. But so often, parents themselves can't even comprehend or don't even know the first thing to be able to how to talk to their children about it, which kind of makes it somewhat stressful as well. And so in the end result is the parents end up not saying anything. Mm-hmm. So how can we even make parents feel more comfortable in addressing the issue, to at least from their perspective, even though we don't always understand why things happen, to maybe help the child to understand?
Well, I think one is to start early, that it's when we begin with younger children, the issues aren't going to be but so complex. And as our children grow up, that we are essentially going on that journey with them, so that what starts off as very simple, factual questions then over time starts to develop into kind of larger ethical and existential questions. And I think that if we begin at that early stage where we're encouraging that conversation, we don't need to jump right into those deep conversations that 14, 15, 16-year-olds are going to have. But if we start with our children when they're 3, 4, and 5 years old, and know that we're building up over time to better understand these things, and at that point you're not going to need to know all the answers, but perhaps over the course of a child's development, those are those opportunities for us to also develop and go on that journey with them. And then I think too is just to really kind of try to drill down on what are the real values and virtues that we want our children to have. I mean, these are complex issues, but I think sometimes to break it down into some very clear-cut options. Do we want our children to be people of fear or people of love? Do we want them to treat other people as human beings or to treat other people as threats? And I think just to really ask ourselves, what are we about, and how are our words and actions, not just in these intentional conversations, but in the side comments we make and the kind of throwaway lines that really reveal what we're really about, to really ask ourselves, what are the values and virtues we want our children to be growing into?
Should we censor what children watch or limit what they watch of these acts of violence or other tragedies? Or should we sit with them and try to answer their questions and allay their fears?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be something every parent needs to figure out for themselves, especially at what point is your child? At what level of maturity are they, and are they capable of that conversation? And certainly every parent has to answer that for themselves, but definitely to know that you need to be the one having that conversation, because especially the way that media and politics starts to break this down, those are not the people you want raising your your children to think independently and ethically, and so I think to really not only be intentional with the conversation, but be intentional in what we are looking at, and to try to break that down, and also to help them just to be able to articulate where they're coming from based on the values that you have as a family.
And of course, from an early age, the bonding is so important. So, this type of relationship is important from the earliest ages, in that trust and building that trust with a parent, and the bonding to know that that child will always be comfortable talking or going to the parent, whether it's the parent or whether it's another mentor as they get older as well, which is really important. So just like anything else we talk about in early childhood, it's the earlier the better. And that relationship starts from the time a child is born. So
yeah, and I think too is that intentionality from the beginning, and also integrity. Both are we having the conversations with our kids, but are we also really living out the kind of values we're encouraging in those conversations? And sometimes that's by accident, and I think to allow that space that when if we explicitly affirm a certain virtue and then our children ask us, well, if that's true, why do you say or do this? To really have space for that conversation, that it's not about you, but about that this is an opportunity for both parents and children to really grow in these conversations, and to not react defensively, but to, in fact, be happy with the fact that your child is exhibiting independent, moral, and ethical judgment, and to be able to have that conversation without getting defensive.
Right.
As a man of the cloth, I have to ask you, how do you answer a child's question, especially in the wake of something like the Las Vegas massacre? Why did God let this happen?
I think one of the things that we try to affirm is that we live in a world that is God's, that belongs to God and is in God's hands, but also one that is broken, one in which we exercise choices that really fall outside of that. And it's hard to kind of, those are kind of two things in tension, and to try to say that I don't know to what extent God's hand is in this, or in which we have the opportunity to make our own decisions. But I do believe in the presence of God in where we see healing, reconciliation, recovery, wholeness, peace. Those are the places where we see God, as Fred Rogers had said on his show, to tell kids to look for who are the rescuers, who are the responders in these situations, and that's a glimpse of where God is in the midst of this. But I think just to acknowledge what is evil and how do we transcend that acts of violence in many ways are driven by fear and despair, and the temptation that children and adults have is to get sucked into that cycle of fear and despair, and we end up creating more and more of an environment that is not conducive to safety and peace. And so I think helping kids to keep their wits about them, and to, again, that fundamental question I asked at the beginning, are we encouraging them to love or to fear? Are we bringing people together, or are we driving them apart? And those are simple questions that I think even younger children can really comprehend, but can really guide us all the way through the rest of our life.
The other thing that you had mentioned when we talk about parents discussing these things with their children is, first off, their own education and being absolutely informed, not with fake news, but in the true news, okay, of the events that have taken place. Okay, and so you've mentioned, the question is, are we going to live with a sense of curiosity and discovery, or are we going to presume we already know? Okay, and that was an issue that was something that was important before we even address these things with children.
Yeah, and I think kind of back with what I was saying in not being defensive when kids maybe kind of push or question us a little bit, is that when we say to educate ourselves, I think that there's a tendency to say, well, are you saying I'm stupid? Are you saying I'm a bad person? Or in other situations, are you saying I'm a racist? Are you saying I'm a sexist? And it's just say, we're all kind of trying to grow in this, and it's not about who's a good person, who's a bad person, but about kind of really questioning where we're coming from and looking for sources that perhaps aren't going to keep confirming us. And I think that we know when we're listening to sources or going online or through social media that's just reaffirming what we already know. And that's fine, but I think when it reaches a point where it's becoming easier to demonize and dehumanize people who are different from us, it's time to really step back and ask ourselves, am I trying to really learn the issues, or am I just trying to really confirm myself? And I think all of us could do well just to not take ourselves too seriously, to not take what we already think too seriously, and to hold on to it provisionally, because we're all human, we're all flawed, we're all busy, we don't have the time to get completely fully educated, and so to really just take things with a grain of salt and to ask, is this trying to bring out an emotional response? And then also just to get to know, what are good, dependable sources that we can go to that have rigorous processes behind them. Like you brought up fake news. I think people wonder, well, why should I believe certain media outlets? It's not because the New York Times or NBC or so on are full of great people. It's because there's a process there that you can't just print or say whatever you want without going through 50 people and confirming your sources. Right. Or, well, why should we believe scientists? It's not because scientists are super smart people, but because they go through a rigorous process where you can't publish anything without having it torn apart, peer-reviewed, and so on. And so I think to really know what are those outlets and resources that have that kind of rigorous process behind them, and what other ones are just ideologically driven or propaganda.
One thing I wonder about, and we've all faced this as parents, they are watching whether it's an earthquake or something like a shooting or a tornado, whatever, and kids don't have a realistic perspective on distance and time and whatever. How can we reassure them that they are going to be safe, that that there's not going to be that hurricane that's hitting Puerto Rico is not coming to Du Bois, Pennsylvania? How do we do that?
Well, I think that it keeps coming back to what we're saying is that children have these perceptions and these fears, and just really creating those spaces where they can bring them out in the open and to have that opportunity for conversation, and just to let them know what this means. And I think also to seek ways of empowerment, that we and our children are not helpless in the face even of natural disasters, but that we have the opportunity to shift that conversation from fear to one of service, to one of giving, to one of reaching out, and helping to steer our kids, that when they see these things, that they don't, that over time that they've been conditioned not to respond in fear and self-preservation, but to respond in generosity and charity and concern for others.
For those listeners, we've been talking to Nathan Royster, who is the pastor of the Brookville Presbyterian Church, and our topic today is how we talk to our children about some of the unpleasant things that have been in the news of late. And Nathan, one of the things that I was about 3 weeks ago, and I got the idea for doing the show. You made reference in a sermon that I attended to. I believe it was a child psychologist, and that's what initially got me interested. So could you kind of relate of what that was all about?
Yeah, an easy conversation about race is what we were talking about. And
is there such a thing?
Yeah,
no.
Right.
And it really tied in with a lot of what we're talking about now, that we're afraid that if we bring up that a child psychologist who I'd heard speak after the demonstrations in Charlottesville had said that a lot of times that we're afraid that if we bring up race, that we're going to activate this idea in children's minds, and that they're going to maybe have some bad beliefs, so we don't talk about it. When in fact, that's the absolute worst thing that we can do, because we do live in a society in which there are differences and discrepancies and inequalities between races and cultures within our country, and children are going to kind of create their own conclusions about that. This child development expert had talked about how there was a child who talked about the smoky people down the street. Well, what was this child talking about? Well, earlier the child had been told that smoking causes your lungs to turn black, and had presumed that that's what this African-American family, how they were that color. And that's kind of a silly example, but it's an example nonetheless of how children left without this kind of conversation might reach some other conclusions that are not gracious, that are not historically rooted, and can lead to some of the consequences like we saw in Charlottesville. I think the gentleman who ran his car through the road, through the crowd, his mother had said, "Well, we just never talked about politics," and I think that that's something that isn't really an option, especially when it comes to these kinds of issues. But again, then also that's going to require us to really do the hard work of not only educating ourselves, but really analyzing our motives, our instincts, our impulses when we're confronted with people who are different, and maybe walking with our kids through that process.
Children grow up initially surrounded by so much love, and then they venture out into the world and they encounter for the first time maybe hatred and cruelty. How can we prepare them for this without robbing them of that beautiful innocence?
I mean, I think, again, we just kind of continue to have that trust, to know that kids can come to us. I mean, especially, there's anxiety that runs through all of these subjects, and children know anxiety. They can feel it, they can smell it on you, and I think just to really stay cool through all of these conversations. I mean, you go through elementary and middle school, you're going to experience some cruelty, and know that you're able to come back to your parent to better understand, why do people behave this way, or how do I respond in a way that protects myself but doesn't end up succumbing to a lot of that cruelty and fear that they've experienced. But I think that if we immediately approach these hard situations with anxiety or a worry about looking stupid, children are really going to sense that, and they're going to know, well, these are just conversations we don't have, even if we never really told them that. So it's about kind of checking our own anxieties so that we will always have that space with our kids.
And the challenge really is with parents. The challenge is for parents to talk to their children, no matter how difficult the subject may be. Rather than to just leave it alone and do the easy thing, they really need to talk to them. And on that subject, we touched on it a little bit when we talk about contrary opinions. The importance of having that conversation, not avoiding it, but also dealing with the implicit bias, where there may be a bias between the parent's opinion and maybe the child's, especially as the child gets older. That's another difficult task, but it still has to be taken, that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, and I think when talking about this, and again, as children are being exposed to not only issues, but then different perspectives on that, is to put it in the best light possible. That when we're raising our kids, I just, and maybe this is just my own values, but we're not there to indoctrinate them. And again, I think what's more important in any particular issue is, are we building a community and society of trust and grace, or is it one of cynicism and fear? And so when, perhaps if your child asks you about an opinion contrary to the one that you have, are you going to say, well, they're just a bunch of liberal or conservative idiots, and get in with the labeling and the name calling? Or can we say, well, I kind of tend to believe this way, but some other people might try to argue this other way, and trying to present it in the best way possible, rather than just, again, raising children to just be suspicious and contemptuous of difference. That's not only bad for them, but it's bad for democracy. It's bad for society, and I think everybody bemoans the tension within our society, but the question is, to what extent do we contribute to that, and to what extent do we help to bridge those gaps and take responsibility?
Well, thank you, Nathan. Obviously, needing positive role models in this society is so important, and this conversation was so enlightening. I thank you so much for being on the program, and hope to have you back again. Thank you.
Yep, thank
Always
you.
feel better when Nathan is on.
Absolutely.
Good things to live
Yes.
by. Thank you. And that's our program for today. We'll be back in 2 weeks at this same time. In the meantime, you can go online to learn more at papromiseforchildren.com. For John Posa and the Northwest Regional Key Program for Quality Early Learning, I'm Joe Taylor. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.